Hey everyone, I just spoke to Elena Simperl, who's a professor of computer science at King's College London. We spoke a bit about her life and career, but we actually ended up spending a lot of time talking about AI and society. So this episode is a little bit different to the usual structure. But I hope you enjoy, and if you do, please share it around and subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks a lot. When were you first exposed, and when did you first become interested in computer programming?
I suppose it was when I was a teenager. I used to be a mathematician in school, and as I was brought up in Eastern Europe, where we used to have a very strong school of mathematics and natural sciences, and so I was competing in maths. I think they used to be called Olympiads at various levels my whole life, basically since I was 9 years old. And then as I was approaching the end of high school, I started thinking I need a change. I was looking for to move away from pure maths to something more applied. And anything related to computation seemed like one possible option to do what I thought would be more applied maths. I was also looking at economics back then. A very good friend of the family said, well, with your background in mathematics, I think you should do computer science because this is going to be the future and computers are going to take over the world and AI is going to take over the world. So then slowly I started learning more and more about programming and about computational thinking, and eventually I did a computer science degree. So quite late actually, and more as a sidetrack to my maths career rather than anything else.
Okay, so it was kind of mathematics that led you there, but did you have any kind of interest in technology at all generally? Were you interested did you read science fiction when you were younger or anything like this?
To some degree. To be honest, having studied computer science and having taught on computer science degree, yes, I find the link to science fiction a bit problematic. I think it is quite reductional in many ways, and I think part of the problems that we have with diversity in computer science degrees and computer science graduates is due to this link that people make or association that people make with what we see in movies, how IT specialists are depicted, and the sort of stereotypes that these sort of media images continue to propagate, and the link to science fiction. Having said that, I did actually read quite a bit of science fiction when I was young, and I moved away from it because very soon, already during my degree, my undergrad degree, I started realizing that the hardest thing in computer science is not the maths that I was doing, and I used to be quite good at it, not so much right now, but actually the hardest thing in computer science is the people. And that moved me very far away from the usual things that you associate with computer hardware and even the maths behind it, more and more into an appreciation of social sciences and economics again, potentially, and human-computer interaction.
Can you say a little bit more about what you mean that the most difficult challenge was the people in that community?
I think a variety of things really, but ultimately that every piece of technology that we are creating is meant to solve a real-world problem, someone's problem. And this could be an individual, or it could be a group of people, or it could be a professional category. And also related to that, everything that we create in computer science, every piece of software, every algorithm, every dataset, every website is created by people as well. And the background and the motivation and the skills of those people have a direct impact on the product. And both of these aspects, I think, are starting to receive more and more attention, especially in the context of artificial intelligence, where there is this understanding that the software itself is so powerful that people and the media are starting asking questions about who creates this, right? And the software itself starts to create new things, and there is a question of ownership and a question of accountability and so on and so forth.
And you said that you think science fiction maybe leads to a slightly problematic kind of few issues there and stuff. Can you give some examples of how you think science fiction has maybe inspired people pursuing maybe wrong
I'm not saying wrong, I'm just saying that it leads to certain people or certain groups feeling more or less directly related to computational thinking and computer science as a discipline. So what I'm trying to say is that if you don't like science fiction, don't worry, come and study computer science, because there's much more in computer science than Black Mirror. Yes, there's a lot of that, and to some degree part of the systems that we are thinking about, the solutions, the experiences that we have at the moment have been defined, described, envisioned in some form in science fiction in the 50s, right? And maybe those were the only frameworks of references we had, and human imagination wouldn't get further than what those books were describing. But my message is, if you don't like science fiction, you will still find something in computer science for you.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything in typical science fiction films that haven't come around yet that you would hope will come around?
I don't know, to be honest. I don't think, going back to what I was saying about how important people are in computing, I think our focus is perhaps too much on one hand on interfaces and how those systems would look like and what they would do, and to some degree some of that functionality is already available right now. I think the big questions that we're grappling with around the ethics of the technology and the societal implications, science fiction literature did allude to some of these big questions and challenges, and we're still trying to approach them right now. I think the difference is perhaps that if you look around the world at the sort of surveillance systems that have been put in place also in the last 2 years, you do start wondering how far we are, or maybe we are beyond some of the societies, dystopian societies that you see that we've been caught in science fiction books. But at the same time, I think there's also positive change, because we do have access to this sort of digital experience much more than before. There is an increased awareness that we need to study the implications of these technologies across disciplines, not just among computer scientists. And there's also an increasing amount of interest from policymakers and the civil society around what it actually means to live in a world where the digital is so present and so important.
Mm-hmm. Could you give any examples of places around the world that maybe have started using technologies, like you said a minute ago, that you could maybe think of as actually dystopian?
Well, I mean, to some degree, we see that pretty much everywhere, and without naming any countries, we've seen an increased use of surveillance of different types in responses to the pandemic. So I think that's one example that has just shown, in this very special, perhaps emergency context, how quickly companies, but also the public sector, can go in collecting data about individuals and using it to define policies that are sometimes restrictive to the individual.
So when you were learning to program, or maybe starting to master it, were you excited by, what were some things that excited you, that you thought would actually be good practical applications of technology for society?
To be honest, I mean, when I was studying, I didn't really think much about that. When I was studying, I was more fascinated about the beauty of programming as a concept, and especially with my maths background, it was just fascinating to learn about the most basic things about how a computer is built and how an operating system works and different level of abstractions and different types of programming and what it means and how you get from something written in this specialized way, those instructions written in a specialized way, to a piece of code that a machine can execute and then produce an actual result, all the way to how people perceive those results and how different people code in different ways and what that means. So I think those were my initial feelings about the subject, and I've learned about practical implications much later, actually, when I started doing my PhD, because I was working on a project that had direct applications to medicine. So we were working with healthcare specialists who were building actually what you would call today a multimodal architecture, AI architecture, to be able to provide diagnostic support to I think radiologists, if I remember correctly.
What was it about program that you found, I guess, still find beautiful?
In many ways, just the same sort of things that I used to like in mathematics, that you have these very abstract principles. I don't know, something as simple as recursion, for instance, so the ability of a program to call itself and do very powerful things with just a few instructions, or different types of data structures, so ways to manage input data at scale in a way that allows you to compute something, to produce a result in an efficient time. So those sort of principles that apply almost universally, really.
Mm-hmm.
Or something like I don't know, the concept of a Turing machine, for instance, or a Turing complete program. So those are things that are so universal and apply in across computer science. And if you think beyond those principles, just like it is with mathematics, you in theory realize some very powerful computational systems that have huge challenges that you could spend your life trying to answer. And to some degree, the community has made progress in those areas, but in many ways, challenges still remain.
In terms of the problems within the kind of people within the computer science community, is one of them that we don't have enough people in the society who can program? Do we need more people to learn coding?
I think it depends. Well, I would say yes, but at the same time, we also need people who are able to think more holistically. So there are issues that you cannot solve with coding. There is no piece in an organization, there is no piece of technology or AI that is going to cut down on red tape. This is a problem that you're addressing, then you need to do much more than have some coders on the team who can program a Power BI dashboard. Say at the same time, yes, I think some coding skills are helpful to anyone, really, just like a bit of Excel is helpful to everyone. And there is a rise. I mean, there's a rise in these what we call high-level programming languages that allow people to write simple programs, perhaps a level of abstraction higher than, say, features in Microsoft Excel, to be able to work with data in their daily lives, ultimately, without having to actually do any sort of computer science degree. I think it's just a matter of literacy, ultimately, but I don't think everyone should be a coder. We do need more people because organizations become more and more digital, because they use more and more data in their decisions, and because the data is now not just an Excel spreadsheet, but actually a bit more varied and a bit larger than that, perhaps. So if you want to implement this sort of digital evidence-based decision making at a bigger scale in any organization, then you do need more people with some coding skills.
What about other professions? Do we need more people working in policy or more philosophers thinking about ethical issues?
Possibly. I mean, philosophers should definitely be involved in that, but it's a much broader conversation. I think we need to understand the sort of policies that need to be made. There has to be a broader consultation that takes into account voices as from diverse backgrounds. There has to be also a better ability at the policy level to keep pace with to just manage the pace of change of the technology. And at the moment there is a bit of a gap there, as we know, right? Technology is changing very, very quickly, and the way policy comes about follows a slightly different time scale, right? So, and then there's also, I suppose, the whole question around how powerful some of these IT companies are, right? And how much they are de facto setting policy. Maybe not the letter of the law, but ultimately when the beginning of the pandemic, you have a handful of companies holding more data about what is going on than governments, or if they decide what is to be censored and what not, whether we like their decision or not, it's still a set of people, unelected, with a lot of power, and that doesn't feel right. And I'm not speaking as a computer scientist, I'm speaking just as a let's just say an informed citizen. When I look at that, so yes, we do need more. This is what I was trying to say earlier when I was saying that I don't think, yes, I think people should program more, but I don't think just having lots of programmers will solve the issue. I think we would need also to have programmers from more diverse backgrounds, and ultimately everyone should use whatever programming tools and should be able to use whatever programming tools they need.
So we'll just bring it back to you again and your story. So
yes,
you did the you did a PhD at the Free University of Berlin.
Yes.
What research did you do as part of that?
Well, so I think I mentioned briefly that I was working in a research project in medicine, and my role was to build a knowledge base, which is basically a lot of data about a particular domain, and that domain was medicine in this case, and that data is structured in a way that allows an AI, in this case it was a machine learning algorithm, to have some understanding of the domain in question. And I think if I remember correctly, we were looking at images that were I think a collection of images used by pathologists. So they were showing cells that pathologists look at using a microscope to understand, to basically reach a conclusion about a diagnostic conclusion. And we were trying to classify those images using just image features, visual features alone, or using reports, for instance, that medics were writing. This was 2004, I think. So it was way before this new wave of artificial intelligence that we're experiencing right now, where we have way more data and lots of data sets and machine learning capabilities that you could use out of the box. Back then, we built this knowledge base from scratch. We try to reuse some existing taxonomies and classification systems from other researchers. So as part of the thesis, what I realized was that there is a huge difference between the theory of building these knowledge bases and the practice of it. And the specific area I was looking at was how one could reuse existing knowledge bases, because they are very complex to build. So back in the day, this involved quite a bit of manual effort, perhaps a bit more than right now when the technology is much more powerful. At the same time, there was an implicit assumption or a recommendation as a researcher when you build a knowledge base like this to try to structure it in a way that is compatible with other knowledge bases, so that you can integrate them and people don't have to rebuild and curate the same sort of knowledge over and over again in each project. But at the same time, when I was looking at someone else's knowledge base, I couldn't understand it. I couldn't understand what it was built for. I sort of realized that there were actually a handful of use cases, of usages for these knowledge bases. And if you factor that in, the structure and the characteristics of these knowledge bases would be very different. And if you take one that was built for one use case and one for a slightly different one, you couldn't just put them together. So I started thinking about the sort of guidance you would give to someone like me when they build a knowledge base like this again, to try to factor in these cases, and when they see another resource online, to try to first understand for what purposes it was built and adjust it so it would be truly compatible to the project at hand. So it was that sort of concern about practical application and guidance to knowledge engineers. This is what I used to be as a PhD student. This was my area of specialism. So what sort of guidance could you give to knowledge engineers to allow them to actually build useful systems in practice? And that's what I wrote about in the PhD. So it was a collection of case studies and practical recommendations.
I've read online that your research these days is kind of on the intersection between AI and crowd or social computing. Mm-hmm. Can you explain what this intersection is?
Yeah. So this is very much a continuation of what I've started to do back then, right? So in my PhD, I basically said, look, unless you document these knowledge bases. So a knowledge base is a piece of AI technology. This is when you say intersection of AI and social computing. The AI for me, at least by training, was this area of knowledge bases, which you see at work, for instance, when you search on Google, right? So when you search on Google for something like, Bush House, you will get lots of documents about Bush House, but you will also get, typically on the right-hand side of the page, you'll get some very specific information about Bush House. So, say the search algorithm knows that Bush House is probably a building rather than the house of Mr. Bush. And it also knows 3-4 specific things about buildings, like opening times and address and a few other things, right? And now if you look for a very different concept, like Chelsea Football Club, you will get very different types of attributes, right? So, and that knowledge that football clubs are different than buildings is part of Google's knowledge base, which they've created over the last 10 years, right? So in my PhD, I basically said, well, building these knowledge bases used to be, still is, quite costly. Lots of them are available online. In theory, they could be reused, but actually, practically, they can't be reused because there's lots of assumptions about their intended use that engineers make when they build them. And without that information, I won't be able to just take it and plug it in to a new system. After that, I've done another piece of research with colleagues in Germany about how much does it actually cost to build these large knowledge bases, because there used to be this assumption that, well, if you just distribute the effort, then lots of people are going to contribute a little bit, and ultimately this is going to grow really, really quickly, like you see on Wikipedia. The result is great. The scale is amazing because you have lots of people contributing at the same time, independently. Still, a project like Wikipedia is perhaps easy to set up in a certain context at a certain time. If I come and ask the world to build a knowledge base, how do I engage with those people? How do I make sure that how do I replicate the success of Wikipedia to any given knowledge base, my medicine knowledge base that I have to build in my project? So that assumption that you would just decentralize things and be able to reuse bits and pieces from somewhere else, and ultimately you will be able to build these sort of knowledge bases quite easily in a sort of a modular way, didn't quite work in practice. And I started looking at how much it actually costs organizations to build these sort of knowledge bases, and looked into models from economics and from software engineering as well that have tried to estimate how much time does it take to write a piece of code. And then how did I get to social computing? Well, so yes, one way to create knowledge bases at scale is to involve lots of people. So you can have a small group of people and they will take 20 years, like they did for one of the most well-known knowledge representation projects in AI, which is called Psych, decades, right? Or you could say, well, what if I'm able to use the input and contributions and resources of 100,000 people, assuming I can reach them and motivate them and so on. Now, when you have 100,000 people who all contribute a little bit, one fact of knowledge to your knowledge base, like they do in a project called Wikidata, which is the knowledge base of the behind Wikipedia and many other projects. So if you manage to do that, then you have all sorts of other interesting challenges. So among these 100,000 people, some of them will be more or less knowledgeable about what knowledge bases actually are. Others will just be interested in writing one small fact about, the village they grew up in and that they know very well, right? How do you, from all these different inputs, how do you actually aggregate everything, make sure it is still correct, despite the fact that some people are more or less experts and more or less motivated and perhaps bored or tired, or are contributing to this knowledge base in their free time on their mobile phone. So how do you make sure that from all these input you aggregate something that you can credibly use in applications, for instance, in a virtual assistant? So when you ask Alexa, what is the capital of Romania, they will be able to tell you it's Bucharest and not Budapest, despite the fact that actually this answer has been compiled by crowdsourcing the question to many, many different people we don't know anything about. And that's the social computing part. So how do you actually look at large groups of people and their contributions to something like a knowledge base or any other sort of online project like OpenStreetMaps and Zooniverse and many others? How do you use computational methods to validate the answers and aggregate them into something that is actually just as good as a professional product? OpenStreetMap versus Google Maps, and Wikipedia or Wikidata versus something like a classical encyclopedia, and so on and so forth. And for that, then you need to use algorithms and to look. So if you ask someone a question about what is the capital of Romania and you get 20 answers, how do you computationally infer which is the one that is most likely to be correct, right? You could look at the distribution of the answers. You say, well, out of these 20 people, 17 said it's Bucharest, so it's probably correct. But then there's other types of questions where the so-called wisdom of the crowds doesn't work in the same way, right? And you have lots of people who just don't know. The question is phrased in a certain way, or it requires a certain type of knowledge. So that distribution of answers is not the best indicator for what the correct answer is. So those sort of computational methods allow you to take all these different types of inputs you have from people and aggregate them into some sort of truth, ultimately a digital resource that you can use in an AI system or in any other type of computational program. The other thing that I do is I look at how the composition of this crowd has an impact on the ultimate, on the end product. So, for instance, if 20 people contribute to the same digital artifact, how diverse should they be in terms of interests and amount of time they've contributed to the project and backgrounds and motivation to have a greater chance to have information that is more representative for a larger group of people. And then when you look at the social fabric of the people who contribute to these large online projects, you see all sorts of interesting patterns, and some of them could be encouraged, but others should perhaps be kept under close observation to make sure that we don't introduce any sort of biases we don't want. And that's part of what social computing does as well.
What do you think about where we're at with diversity and representation in AI?
Do you mean in the field as such, or in applications?
Yeah, within the data itself. Maybe both. Maybe you tackle each one at a time.
Yeah, I think in terms of systems that use AI, I think we're in a better position now than we were perhaps 5 or 10 years ago. But at the same time, AI is used so much more widely, going back to the surveillance systems I was mentioning earlier, that I have the feeling that lots of the conversations we had around ethics and societal implications are lived in different ways in different parts of the world. And that starts with our approach to privacy and data protection and how personal data is used, and that continues to the degree to which companies or organizations more generally have access to the data that you need to be able to create powerful AI models to use internally, all the way to how we do research, for instance. Say, if you do research in AI today, you need access to substantial computational infrastructure, much more than used to be the case in other fields, including in AI a decade ago. So that tells you something about the sort of investment that one needs, about the level of access that certain countries or certain institutions have. And then if you think about how important AI is supposed to become across disciplines, how do you ensure that there is a certain level of access to computational infrastructure to as many people as possible, as many researchers as possible, for them to be able to do competitive research? I think that's an issue that people become aware of, but we haven't really found a solution. I think government will basically need to invest massively to make sure that public sector research does have this access, because otherwise most of the cutting edge research and technology will be available only to a handful of corporate entities. And I have nothing against corporate research, but I think there has to be a level playing field as well. And there should be a critical mass of public sector institutions that should be able to be competitive in this space as well.
Are you optimistic about where it's going, or do you feel more worried than?
No, I mean, I'm not more worried than usual, I would say. I think there's I like the fact that there is a much bigger conversation going on about the implications of using technology than it used to be. I think that's a great development. It is a very complex, rapidly evolving space. I don't think it's something that we will be able to solve from one day to another. Certainly not when we're moving from one crisis to the other, as we seem to be doing. But I think it's good to have this conversation. I think the only thing that we can do is to continue to have it. I think there's also some interesting trends in computer science around sharing research insights more openly, which is very, very positive.
Why do you think that this increase in the awareness, regarding social and moral issues around technology has kind of really risen up over the last few years? Where's that come from?
I don't know. I think it's maybe because I don't know, I couldn't tell. But I do have the feeling that as some of this technology has become pervasive, people and the media have started to pay attention. We're talking about AI algorithms. Well, yesterday I was watching a Netflix documentary about Andy Warhol. So, the Diaries of Andy Warhol, and the voice of Andy Warhol was created by an AI, by a generative program that was trained on probably past recordings. That level of technology adoption and the sort of reach that that technology has is immense compared to maybe 15 years ago, when this was still for many the subject of science fiction books. So when you are watching Netflix documentaries where someone's voice has been recreated using an AI to a very convincing standard, from as far as I could tell. I mean, I am not very familiar with all the nuances of Andy Warhol's voice. And the estate that is managing the legacy of the artist has given permission for this. So this is basically, it sounds like AI is everywhere. And with that, there's perhaps also an increased awareness of positive uses of AI and negative ones. And that's, I think, that's I think the reason why we're talking much more about it. At the same time, I also think that there's like with everything, when there is a conversation in the public sphere about something that is fairly specialized, there's also lots of myths and lots of conversations that aren't perhaps as productive as they could be. So I think we as computer scientists need a much stronger training in anything related to the social implications, societal implications, environmental implications of AI and any of these very powerful technologies that we're working with. We're starting to do this. We're definitely covering this in the degrees here. But I think also for my generation, we haven't had that training. And we should do more of it, and we should train our PhD students as well, and at the same time, one should do the same at the corporate level. I mean, I've seen some very good examples of best practices of how this is done. And there is a certain level of process and frameworks that you can introduce to manage risks. But I think it should be more than that. I think it should be something that we should live by. We all know how to use certain powerful tools like, cars or weapons. AI can be used in various ways, and we should be as responsible and as cautious in using it as any other of these other technologies from the last 150 years.
You mentioned a minute ago about some of the typical myths around AI. What are ones that you that you think kind of typically pop up on the news a lot? Can you give us some examples?
So, there's a whole conversation around, oh, look what the AI has done, right? Which is interesting. Like, look at this painting. Look how powerful this is. And I've built this system that is doing this, without actually wondering what the system is for. And by that, I don't mean necessarily the question of what could someone use this system for if they would want to cause harm. That's a very important conversation as well. I'm just sometimes wonder about just the intended real world problem that something is trying to solve, rather than just show that it is possible, it is feasible. So in this whole question around creativity and AI, right? So here's a piece of Beethoven-like music that the AI has composed, and now let's ask people whether they can distinguish between the real Beethoven and the AI Beethoven. Conclusion: robots are coming and are going to kill us, right? Yes, maybe, but between that and, so first of all, why did you do it? Well, I've tried to show it is feasible. People many times can't tell the difference. Okay, fair enough. Now what? Yeah, so do I have to do this for every other type of composer or genre of music? Is it really worth the computational cycles, as we call them, or the environmental footprint of training and retraining and using all those computers in the data centers just to find this out? In some cases, yes. In some cases, maybe not. What do these technologies actually help with? And if we're not careful about solving actual problems, we might end up in a situation where, in a world like we live today, people will be asking, well, you researchers, what are you actually contributing to society? Yes, you are teaching students, fine, but what else? Your research, what is it actually motivated by? And I think that's an important conversation to have and to keep in mind in a field that is developing as rapidly as AI. There is a lot to be said about curiosity-driven research, but I have the feeling that AI is so hyped that we see it used in all sorts of scenarios without actually providing the scaffolding for or the narrative about the implications, positive and negative alike.
We get to ask you about a specific example then, because in the news in the last couple of weeks there's been this one AI system that has been all the rave from OpenAI, DALL-E 2, which OpenAI say can create original and realistic images and art from a text description. I've had a look at some of those images that have been generated, and they at least seem pretty beautiful and pretty amazing. Some quite cool things. So what would you make of that kind of system example?
I mean, that's a perfect example, right? I mean, fine, impressive. I mean, there's a lot of marketing around systems like this. I think if a company wants to invest their resources in a system like this, if they have a very good understanding of what a technology like this could be used for in a positive and a negative sense, then why not? But from that announcement, to draw any conclusions about AI taking over the world, or on the contrary, AI just being completely insignificant compared to, I don't know, the level of knowledge or learning of a 2-year-old child. So any of these extremes, I think aren't very useful in the conversation. I think for me the important thing is, speaking as a researcher, is that on the one hand we have access to some degree to some of these very powerful systems like the OpenAI ones. At the same time, many research institutions can't keep up anymore. So if we would want to, say, a medium-sized institution in the global south, or even in the UK, if we're thinking about setting up a team and the computational infrastructure it takes to even start building something a few orders of magnitude lower than that sort of system, take quite a bit of time, and that's, I think, what's problematic. Also, I think because of the complexity of these systems, using them should be done with extreme caution, because they could hurt people. I mean, maybe not in this particular example where, given a sentence, you generate an image, but why not, right? I mean, if you even if you think about marketing or social media, or the use of tagging or automatically generated imagery and media more generally, we need to have better accountability of the systems and need to be able to fix these systems if we notice that they are not working in the right way. And for closed systems like the OpenAI ones, that's not easy. That's not an easy thing to do.
So if someone wanted to get into computer science or technology and actually, work on something that's genuinely socially valuable, what advice would you give them?
I think, and as I was saying earlier, I think we're in a much better position now than we used to be 5 or 10 years ago in this respect. I think lots of degrees now do include these sort of questions as well as part of the curriculum. And I see this actually when working with students. There is a greater interest in working in areas that make a difference, especially related to climate change, healthcare, government, which I think is a very positive development. I think in the future there is a trend to become more socially, societally, environmentally aware on technical degrees as well, and I hope this trend will continue. So I think this will happen more or less automatically when you study computer science or artificial intelligence here or pretty much anywhere else in the UK. But I think it's interesting when deciding whether to study computer science or not, to think about the fact that computational technology has now applications pretty much anywhere. Say if there is a particular area or domain that someone's interested in, almost certainly there will be applications and there will be specific challenges, computational challenges, that they will be able to pursue if they're interested.
Elena, thanks so much for speaking. It was great to hear a bit about your story, but also get so much into the stuff about AI. So thanks a lot for talking.
Okay, no problem.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you enjoy the Human Podcast, please consider subscribing. I hope to see you soon.